September 14th, 1944, 200 miles off the Bonin Islands. The vibration was not in the floorboards. It was in his teeth. Kenji Sato sat huddled on the wet steel deck casing of the USS Shark, his hands unbound but gripping the safety railing with white-knuckled desperation. The wind roared like a typhoon, stripping the breath from his lungs. Beside him, young Hiroshi was vomiting seawater, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the deafening thunder of 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines screaming at full power. They were moving. God, they were flying. The ocean, usually a vast rolling plain to a fisherman, had transformed into a blur of violent white foam. Kenji stared at the wake trailing behind them, a massive, churning highway of phosphorescence stretching to the horizon. His own trawler, the Kikumaru, had chugged at a humble 6 knots. This steel leviathan was cutting through the swells at over 20 knots, pushing a bow wave that felt solid enough to crush bone. An American lookout in a bulky raincoat glanced down from the cigarette deck, his face illuminated red by the binnacle light, looking bored. Bored. While they rode a monster that defied the laws of nature known to Kenji. Impossible, Kenji whispered, the word lost to the wind. If the Americans could build machines that moved entire armies at the speed of a destroyer, then the radio broadcasts back in Chiba were wrong. They were all wrong. 2 weeks earlier, Chiba Prefecture, Japan. September 1st, 1944. Dawn, the Pacific, 300 miles southeast of Honshu. The ocean breathed in a slow, rhythmic heave of gray slate. Kenji Sato stood in the wheelhouse of the Kikumaru, his hands calloused and cracked from 40 years of hauling nets, now gripping the worn cedar wheel of a vessel that was no longer just a fishing boat. The Imperial Navy had painted a white rising sun on the funnel, bolted a rusted Type 92 machine gun to the bow, and called it a patrol craft. To Kenji, it was still just a wooden coffin smelling of old mackerel and fear. "Captain," Hiroshi's voice cracked. The boy was 19, his face thin from the reduced rations of rice and barley. He stood over the radio set in the corner, headphones pressed tight against his skull. Static again. The atmospheric interference is heavy. "Keep listening," Kenji said, his voice gravelly. He looked out the salt-streaked glass. The horizon was empty, a terrifying void. "The Americans don't make noise until they are ready to kill you." The Kikumaru's engine, a single-cylinder diesel that sounded like a dying heart, thump, 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 vibrated through the soles of Kenji's tabi boots. They were making 6 knots. 6 knots. A turtle could outrun them. Kenji reached into his tunic and touched the small omamori, amulet, his wife had sewn for him. The instructions from the Naval Command were clear. If you sight the enemy, radio the coordinates immediately. Engage if possible. Die. With honor. Engage, Kenji muttered bitterly. Engage a destroyer with a machine gun that jammed if the air was too damp? He stepped out onto the narrow deck. The air was thick with mist. He looked at the nets piled uselessly near the stern. They were pretending to fish to maintain cover, but the fish weren't biting. Even the ocean felt different lately. Empty, as if the sea life had fled the coming iron storm. "Captain!" Hiroshi shouted from inside, panic spiking his tone. "I heard something. A ping. Like metal hitting metal." Kenji froze. He rushed back inside. "Sonar?" "No." Hiroshi shook his head, eyes wide. "Not sonar. It sounded like water breaking. Close." Kenji grabbed his binoculars and scrambled up the small ladder to the roof of the wheelhouse. He scanned the gray expanse. Nothing. Just the rolling swells. Then he saw it. 500 yards off the starboard beam, the ocean didn't roll. It sliced. A white feather of spray erupted from nowhere, moving against the current. It wasn't a wave. It was a periscope shear. cutting the water with a precision that turned Kenji's blood to ice. It rose higher, followed by a gray, wet steel tower that looked like the dorsal fin of a prehistoric beast. Water cascaded off the hull as the submarine breached, black and slick and monstrously large. "Radio!" Kenji screamed, jumping down the ladder, landing hard on the deck. "Radio command! Enemy surfaced! Starboard side!" But even as Hiroshi's fingers fumbled frantically with the Morse key, the sound of the Kikumaru's engine was drowned out. A deep, guttural roar erupted from the surfacing beast, the sound of high-pressure air venting ballast tanks, and then the clank of steel hatches throwing open. Too fast, Kenji thought, watching the gun crew swarm out of the submarine's tower like angry ants. They were moving with a terrifying practice speed. They are too fast. The cedar wheel fought Kenji's grip, slick with his own sweat. He slammed it hard to port, the rudder groaning in protest. "Hard over! Get the gun!" Kenji roared, his voice tearing at his throat. On the bow, young Takahashi, a fisherman who had never fired a weapon in anger, fumbled with the magazine of the Type 92 machine gun. His hands shook so violently that the heavy pan magazine clattered against the mount. But the Americans were already moving with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. Kenji watched in horror through the cracked window. The submarine's hatch had been open for less than 10 seconds. In that time, 3 men had sprinted onto the wet casing, unlatched the barrel of the massive deck gun, and swung it toward the Kikumaru. It was a 4-inch 50 caliber gun. Against a wooden boat, it was an executioner's axe. "Fire, you fool! Fire!" Kenji screamed at Takahashi. The Type 92 stuttered once, pop, and jammed, a pathetic, solitary cough against the wind. From the submarine, there was no hesitation. A flash of orange fire bloomed from the gray steel muzzle. The sound arrived an instant later, a physical blow that shattered the wheelhouse glass inward. Crack boom. The shell didn't just hit the Kikumaru, it erased the bow. Kenji saw Takahashi vanish in a cloud of splinters, seawater, and pink mist. The explosion lifted the trawler's stern out of the water, throwing Kenji violently against the compass binnacle. Pain exploded in his shoulder. The world tilted sideways. The smell of ozone and pulverized pine wood filled his nose. "Abandoned ship," he gasped. But the ocean was already rushing in through the floorboards. The single-cylinder diesel engine gave one last, choked gurgle and died. Kenji scrambled out of the ruined wheelhouse just as the second shell hit the waterline amidships. The concussion picked him up and hurled him over the railing. He hit the water hard. The Pacific was shockingly cold, a stark contrast to the heat of the explosion. He sank, tumbling in the darkness, surrounded by debris, a floating crate, a torn fishing net, a piece of someone's shirt. He kicked toward the surface, his lungs burning. He broke water, gasping, wiping oil from his eyes. The Kikumaru was gone. Only a patch of burning oil and scattered timber remained. Bobbing near him was Hiroshi, clinging to a wooden hatch cover, face pale as death. Kenji looked up. The black steel wall of the submarine loomed over them, blocking out the sun. It drifted silently closer, the engines now idling with a low, menacing thrum. Men with Thompson submachine guns lined the railing, looking down at them. They didn't look like the demons from the posters. They looked like mechanics in dungarees. A voice boomed from a megaphone, speaking heavily accented Japanese. "Swim to the side, do not dive, or we shoot." Kenji treaded water, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Hiroshi. He should pull the plug on his life vest. He should drown himself for the Emperor. That was the order. But the hull of the submarine was right there, solid and real. A cargo net was thrown over the side, splashing near his head. "Swim!" Kenji choked out, survival instinct overriding honor. He grabbed the rough hemp of the net. Strong hands grabbed his tunic and hauled him up. He was dragged over the pressure hull, his knees scraping against the rivets. He collapsed on the wet steel deck, coughing up salt water, lying at the feet of the enemy. The sky was stolen from them. Rough hands shoved Kenji toward the open hatch on the bridge. An American sailor, huge and shirtless, with grease-stained dungarees, pointed a .45 pistol at Kenji's chest. He didn't shout. He just motioned downward with the barrel. Down. Into the throat of the beast. Kenji hesitated. To enter the machine was to accept his tomb. "Move!" a voice barked from behind. Kenji swung his legs over the lip of the hatch and slid down the steel ladder. The chow air changed instantly. The salt spray and wind vanished, replaced by a thick, heavy atmosphere that tasted of oil and recycled breath. He landed on the deck of the conning tower. Before he could get his bearings, he was pushed further down, into the control room. The sensory assault was overwhelming. It was a jungle of pipes, valves, and gauges, lit by a dim, reddish glow. Men moved with terrifying efficiency, flipping switches and turning wheels, ignoring the two shivering, soaking wet Japanese men in their midst. "Strip," the Nisei interpreter appeared, his face impassive. "Everything, now." Kenji stood paralyzed. "Strip?" "Lice," the interpreter said, as if talking to a child. "We don't want your bugs." Kenji and Hiroshi stripped off their sodden tunics and trousers, standing naked and vulnerable in the center of the enemy's hive. Their clothes were kicked into a corner. A sailor threw them a pair of rough wool blankets. "Forward torpedo room, go." They were marched through a narrow corridor, squeezing past sailors who barely glanced at them. They entered the forward compartment. It was cold here, dominated by 6 brass tubes, the torpedo tubes. Racks of massive, gleaming cylinders lined the walls. These were the teeth that had eaten the Kikumaru. "Sit," the guard ordered, pointing to a canvas mattress thrown on top of the steel deck plates, right beneath a torpedo skid. A sudden, ear-splitting sound tore through the ship. "Ah, Oga! Ah, Oga!" Kenji flinched, covering his ears. "Dive! Dive!" a voice echoed over the loudspeaker. The deck tilted. Kenji grabbed a pipe to steady himself. The sensation was sickening, the floor dropping away beneath his feet. The hum of the diesel engines cut out, replaced by the eerie, high-pitched whine of electric motors. Silence fell over the boat. Not true silence, but a pressurized heaviness. The hull groaned, a deep, metallic pop that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Hiroshi curled into a ball, shaking. "They're going to drown us, Captain. They are taking us down to the bottom to open the hatch." Kenji looked at the depth gauge on the bulkhead. The needle moved steadily. 50 feet, 80 feet, 100 feet. He breathed in. The air was heavy, smelling of diesel oil mixed with battery acid and old sweat. It was the smell of a machine that lived underwater. "If they wanted to kill us," Kenji whispered, wrapping the American blanket tighter around his shoulders, "they would have left us in the ocean." But looking at the gleaming grease on the torpedo above his head, Kenji wasn't sure which fate was worse. He was no longer a captain. He was cargo. 2 hours later, the heavy steel door of the forward torpedo room swung open. "Sato. Only you," the Nisei interpreter said. Kenji stood up, his legs stiff. He looked at Hiroshi, who was curled in a fetal position, muttering prayers. Kenji nodded once, a silent farewell, and followed the guard. They walked aft, through the messing compartment. The smell of frying bacon was so intense, it made Kenji dizzy. Sailors sat at tables playing cards, reading ragged paperbacks. They looked up as he passed. There was no hate in their eyes, only curiosity. One boy, no older than Hiroshi, blew a bubble with pink gum and popped it. Kenji was led into the wardroom. It was a small officer's lounge with green, baize-covered tables and leather bench seats. It felt like a gentleman's club, not a warship. Seated at the table was a man in a khaki shirt with silver bars on his collar, the executive officer. Beside him sat the interpreter. "Sit down, Captain Sato," the interpreter said. His Japanese was perfect, but the intonation was strange. Flat, American. Kenji sat. He stiffened his spine. Name, rank, serial number. Nothing else. The American officer didn't shout. He didn't pull out pliers or a whip. He reached for a silver pot and poured steaming black liquid into a thick white mug. He slid it across the table. "Coffee," the interpreter translated. "Drink." Kenji stared at the black surface. Real coffee? In Chiba, coffee had been replaced by roasted soybeans and dandelion roots 2 years ago. The aroma drifting up was rich, earthy, and maddening. "I'm a prisoner," Kenji said hoarsely. "I expect to be treated as such." The officer smirked and lit a cigarette. He tossed the pack onto the table. Lucky strike. The white package with the red circle. It looked ironically like the Japanese flag. "We aren't interested in your fishing spot, Sato," the interpreter said, leaning forward. "We want to know about the minefields off the Boso Peninsula." Kenji pressed his lips together. "I know nothing." "Don't you?" The officer unrolled a large sheet of paper on the table. It was a map. Kenji glanced at it, intending to look away, but his eyes locked onto the paper. It was a US Navy hydrographic chart. Kenji's breath caught. It was terrifying. The coastline of his home prefecture was drawn with exquisite precision. Depth soundings were marked in fathoms. Every inlet, every shoal, every lighthouse was labeled. "We know the minefield is here." The officer pointed a manicured finger at a sector Kenji knew was indeed mined. "And here, we just want to confirm the swept channel for the fishing boats." Kenji felt a crack in his reality. The radio broadcasts said the Americans were blind barbarians, stumbling in the dark. But this map, it was better than the charts the Imperial Navy had issued him. "How?" Kenji whispered. "We map everything," the interpreter said softly. "We know your waters better than you do." Kenji looked at the coffee, then at the map. The cognitive dissonance hit him like a physical blow. If they knew this much, why was Japan still fighting? It wasn't a war. It was a math equation, and Japan was on the wrong side of the equal sign. He reached for the mug. His hand trembled. He took a sip. The bitter, hot taste of real coffee flooded his mouth, bringing tears to his eyes. It tasted like defeat. Suddenly, the overhead speaker crackled. The casual atmosphere shattered. "Radar contact, aircraft, 6 miles closing fast. Battle station submerged." The officer snatched the map. The interpreter's face went hard. "Pray to your gods, Sato. It sounds like your friends found us." The world shrank to the size of a steel pipe. "Rig for silent running." The order was passed in a whisper, repeated down the line like a prayer in a cathedral. Instantly, the hum of the ventilation fans died. The air conditioning ceased. The submarine, which had been a living, breathing organism, held its breath. The only sound was the soft whir of the creep motors, pushing them deeper. Kenji was shoved back into the corridor outside the wardroom. He sat on the linoleum deck, knees pulled to his chest. The American sailors around him sat too, staring at the overhead pipes or closing their eyes. No one spoke. No one moved. The heat began to rise immediately. Without the fans, the humidity from 100 bodies condensed on the cold steel hull, dripping like sweat. Clank. A sailor dropped a wrench. "Silence!" a chief petty officer hissed, his eyes bulging with rage. Kenji looked up at the depth gauge mounted on the bulkhead. The needle crept past 200 feet, 250 feet. They were going deep. Then he heard it, not with his ears, but through the hull, the distant drone of propellers overhead, Rum, rum, rum. A Japanese patrol bomber. Probably a Mitsubishi G4M Betty or a Kawanishi flying boat, his countryman. Here it comes, a young sailor whispered, gripping a St. Christopher medal. Click. The sound was sharp, metallic, like a hammer striking the hull. The detonator. Ba-boom! The ship lurched violently to port. The steel floor kicked Kenji in the spine. Dust and cork insulation rained down from the overhead pipes, coating them in gray powder. The lights flickered and died, leaving them in the blood-red glow of the emergency battle lanterns. Another click. Wham! Closer this time. The hull groaned, a terrifying screeching sound of metal under torture. A glass gauge shattered somewhere in the control room. Kenji squeezed his eyes shut. In his mind, he saw the pilot above. A young man, perhaps like Hiroshi, pressing the release button, thinking he was serving the Emperor, destroying a demon. He didn't know he was killing Kenji. Make it stop, Kenji thought. He wasn't praying for the Emperor's victory. He was praying for the American welds to hold. He looked at the sailor across from him, the boy with the gum. The boy was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the cork dust on his face. Kenji felt a strange, twisting knot in his stomach. We are the same, he realized. In the dark, under the water, there is no emperor, no president. Just men in a steel tube trying not to be crushed. One more, the chief whispered, looking at the ceiling. They waited. 10 seconds. 20. A minute. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. The drone of the aircraft faded. The depth gauge held steady at 300 feet. The hull had not cracked. Kenji let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He looked at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. He looked at the American boy. The boy looked back, wiped his nose, and gave a shaky, weak nod. A shared survival. A treasonous relief washed over Kenji. He was alive because the enemy was strong. The silence of silent running was broken by the clang of metal on metal. But this time, it wasn't depth charges. It was dinner. The all clear had sounded an hour ago. The ventilation fans were humming again, sucking the heat and fear out of the air, replacing it with the smell of frying grease and baking bread. Kenji and Hiroshi were led back to the crew's mess. It was crowded. Sailors, still grimy from their battle stations, sat elbow to elbow, laughing, smoking, and eating. The terror of death had vanished, replaced instantly by the mundane appetite of young men. A cook, a large man with a white apron stained with tomato sauce, slapped 2 stainless steel trays onto the serving counter. "Chow down, Tojo," he grunted, not unkindly. Kenji stared at the tray. He blinked, unsure if the lack of oxygen earlier was causing hallucinations. There was a thick slab of fried meat, pink and glistening with fat. Spam. Next to it, a mound of yellow, fluffy eggs, a scoop of white potatoes, and in the corner compartment, bright orange slices of peaches in syrup. In Chiba, Kenji's wife was mixing sawdust into the rice ration to make it last. She hadn't seen an egg in 6 months. Here, under the ocean, inside a warship, there was enough food to feed a village feast. They were pushed to a small table in the corner. Hiroshi sat with his hands in his lap, staring at the food with a mix of hunger and revulsion. "It is poison," he whispered, "or it is a trick. We cannot eat the enemy's rice." Kenji picked up a spoon. It was heavy, solid silver plate, stamped USN. "If they wanted to kill us, Hiroshi, they would have let the depth charges do it." Kenji cut a piece of the meat. He put it in his mouth. It was salty, fatty, and incredibly rich. His stomach cramped in shock, then roared for more. He ate the eggs. He ate the potatoes. He looked around the room. A sailor near them stood up, scraping his leftovers into a garbage can. Half a slice of meat, a spoonful of potatoes, thrown away, discarded like trash. Kenji stopped chewing. The wastefulness stunned him more than the flavor. They have so much, he thought, a cold dread settling in his gut, that they can throw it away. Japan was fighting with bamboo spears and spirit. America was fighting with an inexhaustible assembly line of meat and steel. "Eat, Hiroshi," Kenji said quietly, his voice hollow. "Eat. We have already lost. Captain, look at them," Kenji gestured with his spoon at the loud, well-fed crew. "They are not starving. They are not desperate. To them this war is a job, and they have better tools." He swallowed the sweet, syrupy peach. It tasted like sunlight, a cruel reminder of the surface world they had been dragged from. Suddenly, the deck began to vibrate beneath their feet, a low, powerful rumble that shook the silverware on the table. The diesels, all 4 of them. "Secure from Chow," a voice bellowed. "Surface, surface, full power on the main engines." The shark was rising to hunt again. September 14th, 1944, 200 miles off the Bonin Islands. "Topside, move." The command was barked by the chief of the boat. Kenji and Hiroshi were guided up the ladder, past the whistling air of the main induction valve, and out into the night. The transition was violent. They emerged from the stale, pressurized air of the hull into a roaring hurricane. Kenji gripped the railing of the cigarette deck, his eyes stinging from the salt spray. The night was pitch black, but the ocean around them was alive with light. And then, the memory aligned with reality. The moment he had feared and denied arrived. The vibration was not in the floorboards, it was in his teeth. The 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines below were screaming, unleashing 5,400 horsepower into the shafts. The sound was a physical weight, a deafening thunder that obliterated thought. They were moving. God, they were flying. Kenji stared aft. The Kiku Maru had left a gentle ripple, a polite disturbance in the water. The USS Shark was tearing the Pacific Ocean apart. A massive rooster tail of whitewater rose 10 feet into the air behind the stern, glowing green with phosphorescence. The wake stretched back for miles, a churning, violent highway of foam that looked solid enough to walk on. 20 knots, Kenji whispered, the number forming in his mind like a sentence. 20 knots. His fishing boat made 6. The Imperial destroyers made 30, but they were sleek greyhounds. This was a whale swimming at the speed of a shark. It was unnatural. It was a feat of engineering that defied everything he knew about heavy industry. Beside him, Hiroshi was retching over the side, but Kenji couldn't look away from the water. An American lookout in a bulky raincoat glanced down from the periscope shears, his face illuminated red by the binnacle light. He looked bored. He checked his wristwatch. Boredom. That was the weapon. The Americans weren't just winning. They were commuting to the war. They built machines of terrifying complexity. Radars that saw in the dark, sonars that heard iron hearts beating, and engines that pushed to 1,500 tons of steel through the water faster than a man could run, and they treated it as routine. Kenji looked at his hands gripping the cold, wet steel of the railing. These were hands that mended nets, hands that prayed to spirits of the sea. But spirits did not build diesel engines. Spirits did not preserve peaches in syrup. Spirits did not map the ocean floor with sound. Impossible, Kenji said again, the word ripped away by the wind. He looked at Hiroshi, who was wiping his mouth, eyes wide with the same realization. The boy's fanaticism, his desire to die for the Emperor, was dissolving in the face of this raw kinetic energy. You could not fight an avalanche with a sword. You could not fight the future with the past. The submarine pitched forward, smashing through a swell, sending a sheet of spray over them. Kenji didn't flinch. He just stood there, soaked and shivering, watching the white wake of the American Leviathan carve a scar across the face of his world. The war was over. It had ended the moment this machine was launched. September 20th, 1944. Submarine base, Pearl Harbor. The engines finally stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar. Kenji walked up the gangplank, blinking in the harsh tropical sunlight. His legs, accustomed to the roll of the sea and the vibration of the diesels, felt unsteady on the solid concrete of the pier. He looked up, and his soul withered. He had expected a fortress. What he saw was a factory. Stretching as far as his eyes could see were rows of gray steel hulls. Not just the Shark, but dozens of submarines, tied up side by side like sleeping whales. Welders' sparks showered down from massive scaffolds where damaged ships were being repaired with feverish speed. Above them, a giant hammerhead crane swung a crate the size of a house through the air as if it were a toy. The noise was a symphony of industry: riveting guns, forklifts, truck engines, and the shouting of men. "Move along," a Marine MP said, nudging Kenji gently. Kenji walked past mountains of supplies. Crates of ammunition, pallets of Coca-Cola, stacks of new tires, pyramids of canned meat. It was an endless, overflowing river of material. In Japan, they were collecting temple bells to melt down for scrap metal. Here the Americans seemingly paved their roads with steel. He looked at Hiroshi. The boy was weeping openly now, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The lie was dead. The effete, weak Americans were not weak. They were titans of production. Kenji stopped for a moment, looking back at the USS Shark, the boat that had destroyed his life. It sat low in the water, oil-stained and rusted from its patrol, diesel fumes still drifting from its vents. It was just a machine, a tool, operated by men who chewed gum and complained about the heat. "Let's go, Captain." The Nisei interpreter appeared beside him one last time. He offered Kenji a cigarette. Kenji took it. He looked at the interpreter, then at the American flag snapping lazily atop a warehouse. "You have won," Kenji said quietly, lighting the cigarette. "The war isn't over, Sato," the interpreter replied. "No." Kenji exhaled a plume of smoke, watching the crane lower a fresh torpedo into the belly of another waiting submarine. "The fighting is not over, but the war was decided before the first shot was fired." He turned his back on the sea. He walked toward the waiting truck, a prisoner of war, but a man finally burden-free of the illusion. The steel giant hummed behind him, preparing to go back out, indifferent to his revelation, fueled by an ocean of oil and the terrible, unstoppable momentum of history.